What impact has a devastating earthquake had on Morocco and Moroccans? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted, despite the circumstances, to be speaking with Samia Errazzouki. Samia Errazzouki is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. She previously worked as a Morocco-based journalist with the Associated Press and later Reuters. She is co-editor of Jadaliyya and social science editor at the Journal of North African Studies. Samia Errazzouki, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for having me.
Untold tragedy and suffering in Morocco in recent days after this devastating earthquake. I'd like to start by asking you, what do we know about the human cost and material destruction produced by this earthquake?
So thank you again for having me. And I would like to first start by conveying all my condolences to those who lost loved ones. So unfortunately, the death toll continues to mount. Every few hours, the Ministry of Interior is updating its numbers. The latest are a little over 2,900 deaths and injuries at over 5,500. And so we can assume that, unfortunately, that number is going to continue to mount.
And one reason is that most of the deaths have been recorded in the more accessible urban centers, while many of the villages have yet to be reached. Is that correct?
This opens up a Pandora's box of some of the issues that we're dealing with. Firstly, there has been reports of local authorities preventing people from burying their loved ones until their deaths have been actually counted and death certificates have been issued, which has posed a logistical problem and also has angered locals. I know we're digressing a little bit, but just to touch on this, in Islamic tradition, it's customary to bury the dead as soon as possible.
And certainly
ideally
before the next sunset.
before the next sunset. And so now footage has been emerging from the remote villages of bodies piled up next to dug graves, and people just awaiting the green light from authorities to be able to bury them. So that's one element. It's also the fact that many of the villages that are hardest hit and the most remote have not even been reached. I mean, there's one village that we read about in which even the local officials there have died. There is not a single connection to the central capital city of Rabat to convey those numbers. So that's a situation that we're dealing with. In terms of material costs, there were reports of economists estimating that up to 2% of the GDP of Morocco will be lost in this process.
And do we have any indication, the reports of entire villages being wiped out, of housing stock being lost, of course, of cultural gems in the city of Marrakesh being damaged or destroyed?
Yes, unfortunately, there has been footage and reports of a number of historical sites that have been damaged or totally destroyed, villages entirely wiped out. And so now it's a question of just taking stock and getting a sense of the total damage, because even that hasn't fully been documented, fully been gathered. And then the rest will be a matter of starting to rebuild.
And the brunt of this earthquake, as I understand it, hit in a mountainous area. Can you give us an indication of the geography, the society, the economy of the affected area?
So the epicenter of the earthquake was in the region of El Haus, which sits in the high Atlas. We're talking about an extremely mountainous region, very difficult terrain to navigate, even notwithstanding an earthquake, right? Just on a day-to-day basis, this is a region that is extremely difficult to get to. And so the terrain itself is very rugged and hard to navigate. The climate is harsh. We're talking about extreme cold, extreme heat. And so those circumstances alone make that region very harsh and difficult to navigate and even live in. Despite those circumstances, we're also talking about a region that has been deprived largely of basic infrastructure. And this is sort of reflective of the way the state has treated and approached development in Morocco, heavily prioritizing urban areas at the expense of rural areas. And the majority of these rural areas are predominantly inhabited by the indigenous Amazigh community, who themselves have been marginalized by the state in many ways over the past decades, starting since colonialism, when the Moroccan state adopted Arabization as the state policy. And so in this particular region in House, we're talking about very high levels of poverty, marginalization, and those compounded with an earthquake of this magnitude have just created a huge amount of loss that is going to be a major obstacle to move forward in terms of rectifying and trying to clean up.
And with the exception of Marrakesh, I presume this is a primarily agricultural area?
Predominantly, yes. And the vast majority of the households in this community, in these communities, will have a breadwinner that lives outside, either in an urban center or abroad.
And it's also, I think, a region from which many Moroccan migrant workers in Europe originate.
Yes, absolutely. And especially migrant workers within the urban centers of Morocco. Another element of this region, and what may or may not help explain the magnitude of the devastation, is that much of the housing here is built from clay. And that is one of the reasons why we're seeing such a great amount of destruction, right? Clay as a building material is not very durable. And on top of the earthquake, now we're seeing reports of mudslides, especially with forecasted rains, which have hit recently Libya, as many have probably seen. So it's layer upon layer upon layer of factors.
And to give an indication of the intensity of this earthquake, we're told about buildings in Marrakesh, for example, that have survived for hundreds of years, but were unable to survive this most recent catastrophe.
Right, and minarets of very historic mosques trembling and cracking. Apparently, there were reports that people in Lisbon, Portugal, were able to feel the earthquake. So that gives a sense of how massive it was.
If we now turn to the topic of the response to this earthquake, which you've already briefly alluded to, as you know, there's been growing criticism within the earthquake zone, particularly about of the Moroccan authorities for their response to the earthquake. What are the main criticisms you've been hearing about?
So one of the first critiques that has emerged has been the state's lack of communication, lack of transparency. It took 20 hours for the state leadership to issue a statement about the earthquake, its plans, its immediate plans for their response, and to convene a meeting of the cabinet.
You're talking about the government now.
So when I talk about the state, right, talking about where the authority actually resides, which is under the authority of the king, the palace.
The royal court. No.
And this followed reports that the king had only recently arrived to Morocco after flying from Paris, where he has been staying for an extended period of time. And so it was only 20 hours after the fact that we get a statement. And even then, a matter of 3 or 4 days, there was absolutely no appearance of any state official and any media outlet answering questions, providing information. There hadn't been a press conference. So there was a huge vacuum in terms of information, which created a situation of, unconfirmed reports just circulating. And then the second criticism has been how the state has been responding to offers of foreign aid. And one of those has been that in order for Morocco to actually receive foreign aid, it needs to formally request it and authorize it for it to enter. And for 2 days, maybe even 3, there had been not a single report of any foreign rescue mission entering Morocco, despite the fact that countries all over the world, including the US, France, multiple other countries offering aid, Where was that aid? No one had no idea. And only recently now, I believe yesterday, the Ministry of Interior issued a statement addressing this question, but still being selective about aid from which country it was accepting. So there has been a huge scandal surrounding Morocco's refusal to accept French foreign aid because of diplomatic tensions. And the third major critique has been the lack of state support on the ground. I was reading the New York Times covering a report that just astounded me, that the journalists on the ground witnessed state television camera crews recording a rescue mission taking place. But the moment that they turned the cameras off, everyone left, including the rescue mission. And this was something that the locals were saying. We have been waiting for state support. We have been doing everything ourselves. These people haven't slept. Children are even involved in the rescue efforts. So total absence of the state. Those are the three main critiques that we are seeing.
And so it's not just a communication problem. Usually when it comes to disasters of this magnitude, the armed forces are usually best equipped to participate in rescue efforts. Have we seen the Moroccan army being mobilized to go to this region?
Again, it was a little less than 20 hours after the earthquake hit that the palace issued a statement that the king had formally instructed the Royal Armed Forces to carry out emergency response measures. And so, again, count it, about 20 hours.
And are these criticisms being directed at the local authorities, at the government, at the royal palace, all of them, perhaps others?
So we have to sort of take a step back and look at what the situation of freedom of expression is in Morocco. Unfortunately, it's a country where any critique of the king is criminalized. And locals are aware of that, right? So any critiques that are being expressed will be done in a way that conforms to sort of local customs, I guess.
You don't cross any red lines.
Absolutely. And definitely not this time. I mean, look, on the one hand, right, there's urgency, there's a set of priorities right now. And for the majority of the people that are on the ground, the priority is rescuing those that are still stuck under the rubble. And so leveling, sharp critiques against the state are not top on the list. But in the moments of frustration and, in these situations unfolding, we have seen individuals just sort of lamenting an overall absence of the state and saying that sort of this is to be expected. Again, we're talking about a region that has historically been marginalized from the Moroccan authorities, deprived of basic infrastructure, paved roads aren't present, running water and stable and durable electricity access is not always a given in these regions. So for better or for worse, it's a situation that many of the locals in this region are accustomed to, the absence of the state. So at this point right now, sort of about a couple of hours right before we started speaking, we saw that the king of Morocco just arrived in Marrakesh, where he's visiting survivors in a local hospital.
I was going to say, I think when you have disasters of this magnitude, criticism of the authorities, irrespective of their performance, is perhaps to be expected. But you mentioned looking for survivors under the rubble. Then there's, of course, also the issue of emergency housing, of food and water supplies, and so on. Do you have an indication of if and to what extent that is being provided to these people in this devastated region?
So it's trickling in. Unfortunately, there are still villages that have been out of reach. Individuals on social media are posting how certain villages have yet to see any aid, any rescue mission teams, nothing whatsoever. In other instances, again, this sort of speaks to the nature of the Moroccan state governance and the heavy bureaucracy involved. So there were reports that many volunteers who were attempting to enter the region from the urban areas, bringing with them food and medical supplies, were turned back because they didn't have the proper authorization to distribute those materials, and that there are certain laws that dictate charitable association work. So
They need a
there's
permit to dig someone out of the rubble, basically.
so that's the situation. Nevertheless, we are seeing various actions and the distribution of aid unfold, though not evenly, I would say, across the region.
So thus far, it's mainly been a situation where local needs are primarily being met locally rather than nationally.
And this is tale as old as time. I mean, I think that's been one of the uplifting things to see. But I want to stress that it's being done out of necessity, that
Yes.
it's local members of these communities that are helping one another.
Mhm.
Um, and it's something that they have done for centuries. It's one of the reasons why they've been able to survive and exist under these very harsh conditions and marginalized conditions. But yes, one of the common images that we are seeing on the ground is locals just helping one another. I was watching this one media report of how a young man just single-handedly rescued a whole entire family of 6 from the rubble with just his bare hands. And these are the kinds of life-saving actions that are taking place behind the scenes and outside of the spotlight, right, in the absence, again, of the state.
And if we turn now from the local to the international, what has been the regional and international response to this disaster?
So luckily, countries from all over the world, all over the region, have expressed their support, solidarity, and offered aid in whatever form. Even countries that have traditionally and historically been foes of Morocco, for example, Algeria.
Mhm.
Um, but countries all over the world have expressed their support, offered aid, and right now it's just a question of waiting for that aid to be authorized to enter. Um,
So
I
you
guess.
haven't seen a situation where this has been kind of subordinated to existing agendas and priorities, whether by Morocco or other states in the region or farther afield.
So the one exception to that has been France. In the French media and the Moroccan media, there's been this fixation on uh, reports that Morocco has allegedly refused the entry of French foreign aid, and this sort of tit for tat ongoing in the French and Moroccan media that is very reminiscent of a lot of the colonial discourse, right? Well, can Morocco actually survive this without France's help? And then Morocco retorting, right? This back and forth, unfortunately, I think what has been lost in it is the lives that are at stake. But
And I
yes,
think a similar
unfortunately,
situation with Spain.
no, actually, Spain was one of the first countries to be granted authorization to
I see.
distribute its aid. It was confirmed by the Ministry of Interior in a statement yesterday. Spain, in addition to Great Britain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, were among the 4 first countries to be granted authorization. But yes, so France, being this sort of sore point. And, observers have noted, well, it's ironic that Morocco won't authorize French aid, yet French healthcare seems to be just adequate for when the king needs open heart surgery.
Right.
And so, again, the politics of it, I think, are unfortunate because this is not the time to bicker and nitpick about this when lives are at stake. And many lives could have probably been saved already. As we know, the first and immediate hours of any emergency are the most crucial, the most important. And given that that 20-hour window had passed before we even got a statement from the state, this is not the time for that
Now,
discourse.
against that background, as you know, natural disasters, or more specifically, the failure of governments to adequately respond to natural disasters can often lead to political challenges or even political change. Do you think that this earthquake and its aftermath will have any lasting social or political effects, also taking into account, as you mentioned, that it's taking place in a relatively isolated region? And if you do think so, what might these effects be?
So Morocco is a country that is prone to earthquakes because of where it sits on the tectonic plates. And um, some of those earthquakes, at least in recent history, have been quite devastating. The most devastating of which was in 1960, the earthquake that shook Agadir. In the aftermath of that earthquake, the city of Agadir was actually entirely moved from where it was in this sort of elevated plateau down closer towards sea level, and new building codes were established and relatively strictly enforced. And we're talking about a city that is not in, too far off from the region of Al Hawz, south of Marrakesh. And then we had in 2004 another devastating earthquake that happened in the Rif region in Hoceima. So earthquakes, unfortunately, are part of the historical fabric of Morocco. Like you mentioned, can't avoid them. What we can control is our responses to them. And historically, we have seen this brief window and moment of, okay, let's learn from this and ensure that the devastation of this magnitude is constrained and contained to the best that we can. And then obviously time goes by and we see the regression of a lot of the same issues that caused those issues that could have been controlled. So it's hard to predict what will emerge from this. I think what makes this time different is with the extensive use of media platforms that have shed light on the circumstances unfolding in ways that otherwise would have likely remained in the shadows, means that there is greater awareness, not just within Morocco, but in the broader international community, about the circumstances under which people in this region, the region of Al Hawz and other rural regions in Morocco live, right? Many tourists will visit Marrakesh and Tangier and the beaches, eat the tagines, go on their camelback rides in the sand dunes. But the moment you step out of these tourist hubs, the reality that many Moroccans live is akin to this. And this is the condition, these are the conditions that Moroccans have been demanding be addressed for years, decades. And one could hope that in the aftermath of this, there will be some sort of accountability, some measures taken to ensure that basic infrastructure is a given, right? That should not just be taken for granted, that access to remote areas is made so that in the case of another natural disaster, emergency response teams are able to get quickly there. Pave the roads, make sure that there is a hospital nearby and that locals don't have to go all the way to Marrakesh for basic medical treatment. These are very basic things. Instead, we have seen the Moroccan state focus and allocate its resources to expanding and further developing urban areas that are already developed. I mean, Morocco just recently invested $2 billion in upgrading the national railway system to the high-speed rail. Meanwhile, the train railway system doesn't go further south than Marrakesh. Rather than extend the actual railway system nationally, we're already upgrading something that is already pretty functional. So that would be a wish, right? Whether or not that happens, we'll wait to be seen.
I'd now like to ask you about another natural disaster in North Africa that unfortunately came to pass after we had communicated about discussing the earthquake in Morocco, and that concerns the devastating floods in Libya, and specifically in Darna in the country's northeast, where we now have reports of thousands of dead and many more missing, as apparently entire neighborhoods were washed out to sea after several dams collapsed on account of torrential rains. I think an important difference, of course, is that you can't predict earthquakes, but this is a storm that provided ample warning of its arrival, and that unlike Morocco, Libya doesn't have central governance, or at least hasn't in recent years. What are your impressions of the catastrophe in Libya?
It's devastating and it's heartbreaking to see. And, you know, to see two parts of the Maghreb region from which I am, suffer is very painful. And as you mentioned, there are a whole set of governance issues separate, right, to the situation in Libya. And I would also note that one of the major also differences is the scope of the casualties in Libya at the moment. I think it's unfortunate that international media attention has not really shed much light on the situation in Libya, but there are a whole set of other problems related to that in terms of journalists being able to access and report in Libya. So my hope is that the devastation that is taking place in Morocco doesn't come at the cost of paying attention and ensuring that the Libyan people also get the help that they need.
And finally, I wanted to ask you, how would you advise listeners who are looking for ways to help?
So there are a number of organizations that are distributing and aid and collecting funds. I would highly recommend Food Bank Maroc, a very well-established NGO with a very solid track record. I would also recommend folks take a look at the GoFundMe page set up by Brahim El-Gwabli, who was a member of our team at ASI, who has started this GoFundMe page with several other Moroccan American academics who have a connection to these communities and have plans to ensure that the funds get to where they need to be the most.
And also a way to avoid the scammers, which unfortunately invariably proliferate under such circumstances.
Yes.
Samia Errazzouki, I'm very sorry we had to have this discussion under these circumstances, but I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.